Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 194 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. The National Park Service describes itself as an agency that's meant to take care of all the special places saved by the American people so that all may experience the heritage of the United States. And yet, for many people, the name National Park Service evokes mental images of parks like Yellowstone, Grand Teton, or even a park like Glacier. But after its creation in 1916, the National Park Service started adding battlefields and historic sites to the resources under its protection. So today, well over a third of the National Park Service's parks and sites are located in urban areas. So, what do these urban parks look like? Many of them look like historic houses, monuments, and even collections of sites that have played an important role in United States history. I mean, think of a place like Independence National Historical Park. That park looks nothing like the Grand Canyon. Instead, it encompasses 55 acres in the heart of downtown Philadelphia and includes many historically significant sites like Independence Hall. Or you could think of a smaller park. You might think of a place like the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, located in Cambridge, Massachusetts. In fact, today, that's exactly what we're going to do. Supervisory Park Ranger Garrett Cloer joins us so that we can get a feel for some of the history and sites the National Park Service manages and preserves for us. And we're going to get this feel by exploring Garrett's Park, the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. Now, this National Historic Site is actually quite significant because it served as both the residence and headquarters of General George Washington during the Siege of Boston in 1775-76, and is the home and property of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, that famed American poet and literary figure of the 19th century. Now, during our exploration of this house, where both George Washington and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow slept, Garrett reveals the early history of the house and its construction by John Vassal, details about how the Vassal House came to serve as George Washington's home and headquarters during the Siege of Boston, and information about how both Washington and Longfellow used and experienced life in the house. But first, we're meeting up in Cleveland next week on Saturday, July 21. The meetup will take place at Shooter's Waterfront Cafe from 4 p.m. to about 5:30 p.m. Now, I've placed a link to the restaurant in your Ben Franklin's World app and in the show notes. If you have any questions, or if you plan to attend, please send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. All right, are you ready to explore the house that both Washington and Longfellow called home? Let's go meet our expert guide.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Our guest is a supervisory park ranger at the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site. He's a 9-year veteran of the National Park Service who has worked at sites such as the Minuteman National Historical Park and Independence National Historical Park. He's also a Michigan native who graduated with a master's degree in history from Central Michigan University. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Garrett Cloer.
Thank you, Liz. It's my pleasure.
Garrett, I am so excited you could join us today because as a former National Park Service ranger myself, I know that when most people think of the National Park Service, they think of the big natural parks, Yellowstone, Yosemite, the Grand Canyon. What never ever seems to be top of mind, of course, are the large national historical parks or the national historic sites. So I wonder if we could start our conversation with you telling us a bit about the National Park Service and its work as a steward of United States history.
It's interesting you say that because speaking as someone who has always worked in historic sites, it's a little bit frustrating because there's a lot more of us than there are the big natural parks. The National Park Service very quickly, after its creation in 1916, started adding things like battlefields and other types of historic and cultural sites. We're also, I think people don't tend to think of us as having a big presence in urban areas, but well over a third of our sites are in the larger metro areas in the country. And that's really become an emphasis for the agency. Starting a few years ago, we started looking at ways to build deeper relationships with those communities that we're in. The National Park Service does have a long history of historic sites. It also administers the National Historic Register. So we're talking more than 90,000 sites are on that list beyond the ones you think of as specifically ran by the National Park Service. So the agency does have a very large part of its mission dedicated to preserving and telling the stories of the history of the country.
Now, in terms of your National Historic Site, the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, that seems to be a really interesting place in that it has really two very different histories to tell. So I wonder if you would tell us about the house and the different histories it allows the National Park Service to convey to visitors.
Sure. The two big stories, of course, are right there in the name of the site. So it was the home and headquarters of George Washington from the middle of July 1775 until the beginning of April 1776. So that little less than 9 months is actually going to be the second longest amount of time that Washington will spend in any one headquarters during the entire 8 years of the Revolution. Then many years later, starting in 1837, first as a boarder, it becomes the home of a young Harvard professor named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow that soon would become the most famous writer in the United States and would end up spending 45 years in the house. And the house would actually belong in the ownership of the Longfellow family for almost 130 years before coming to the Park Service. We like to actually think, though, that our story is even larger than those two. I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration that if you give us enough time, we can connect almost anything that happens in around 200 years of American history to somebody who was in the house. So it ends up having a very, very large story, especially, it's a big house, but it is just a house. And it ends up having this very large story and really reflecting the history of the United States in general.
Oh, I think we need to test this theory, Garrett. James Madison. How does Madison connect with the house?
James Madison. Okay, let me think. So I would say if I think of Madison, I think of the United States Constitution. And when I think of the United States Constitution, I think of the president of the convention being George Washington, of course. So I think there's that tie directly, but I think even more than that is Washington's political beliefs are profoundly changed and shaped by his experiences as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. And you see the failings of the Confederation government during the war to supply his army. And so those experiences are really going to shape him into being the key nationalist leader. And of course, he works very closely and with Madison to achieve that nationalist vision.
All right, how about one more, because I'd really be remiss if I didn't ask you this one. Benjamin Franklin.
Benjamin Franklin has a direct link to the site because he actually came to it and met with Washington in October of 1775 for a week-long meeting where they went over a bunch of the issues that were facing the Army and directly links what's going on in headquarters with the Continental Congress down in Philadelphia.
You were so quick with your answers, Garrett. I feel like we made this test way too easy. But there really does seem to be a lot of connections with this house.
For sure. When I came from Philadelphia, I wondered what I would talk about after working in the birthplace of the United States, as we like to call it. And then I was coming to this one house. I've learned something every day, I think, in the 6 years that I've been there. It's amazing.
Now, speaking of this house, before it was known as the Longfellow House, and before it served as George Washington's headquarters, it once belonged to a man named John Vassal. Would you tell us about Vassal and about the early history of the house?
Sure. John Vassal was just 21 years old when he builds the house. He had recently graduated from Harvard College just down the street. And he actually had come from a very old New England family. Some of his relatives were amongst the earliest settlers in Massachusetts, but they had apparently run afoul of some of the religious authorities in the colony. So they ended up moving to the Caribbean, where John's grandfather, Leonard Vassal, is going to found sugar plantations, which provide the wealth for the family. Leonard is going to move back to Massachusetts by at least 1723. And he's actually going to build a house, which today you can visit as the retirement home of John Adams down in Quincy as part of Adams National Historical Park. Then Leonard's son, John, is going to buy property out on the road to Watertown, which is today known as Brattle Street. And he's going to unfortunately die when his son, also named John, is just a little boy. He is going to be raised in the household of his maternal grandfather, Spencer Phipps, who was the lieutenant governor of the colony. But once he turns 21 years old, one of the first things he will do is tear down his dad's old house and build himself a new one in 1759. He eventually owns about 90 acres around the house. He also is going to own a couple of other houses in the Boston area. In 1761, he marries Elizabeth Oliver. Her brother is going to play an important role later in this story. His name was Thomas Oliver, and in 1774, he becomes the last royally appointed lieutenant governor of the colony. And Thomas Oliver is going to marry John Vassal's sister, also named Elizabeth. So he's very tied into the elite colonial leadership. And as you can tell, if you come out and visit the house, you don't find too many houses in the New England area that look quite like ours from the colonial period. And so you can easily tell he's amongst the absolute elite of colonial Massachusetts.
I'm really curious by what you mean by we won't find many houses like John Vassal's house in colonial New England. Is there something really special about this house's architecture that made it really different from other New England houses?
So the easiest thing to notice is its size. I think most of us, if you've been to colonial houses in New England, you tend to have that salt box style in your mind, which was very adapted to the New England environment. Ours is very different. It is Georgian architecture, which became popular in the 1730s, 40s in England itself, and then spreads throughout its colonial possessions. But it is symmetrical, everything inside and outside of the house. The rooms are very large. The ceilings are very high. In fact, you couldn't have heated the place in the winter just using the fireplaces. So that's when those other houses that John happened to own in the area would come in handy. But he is very explicitly stating how he views himself as a prosperous British gentleman when he chooses the design of his house.
Now, John Vassal would have to abandon his house by 1775, and I have to imagine his abandonment had something to do with his Oliver family connections, as the Olivers were loyalists during the American Revolution. Is this indeed why Vassal had to abandon his house, because of loyalism?
It was. He actually had to make his decision pretty early. In September of 1774, there's an event which directly affects our neighborhood. It was a very distinctive neighborhood. Today, Brattle Street is about 1.5 miles long, and in 1774-75, there were only 7 houses along that stretch of road. So these were all big, large farms, and the families had all intermarried with each other, in addition to the Olivers, which had built a house about 1 mile down the street. The Attorney General for the colony is living on the road. There are 2 other families that had married relatives of John Vassal. And all of these families remain loyal to the empire. I think, there's the economic ties directly to the larger empire. They are all also Anglican, making them even more unusual for colonial Massachusetts. And in September 74, there's an event called the Powder Alarm, which sees about 4,000 men coming into the neighborhood. So basically, the insurgency pays a visit to that little community in Cambridge, and all of the families end up evacuating their homes.
After John Vassal vacates his house, it does become George Washington's headquarters. And I'd really like for us to explore this aspect of the house's history. But before we get to that point in the story, it seems to me like we should really try to understand the two events that brought Washington to Boston. And those two events were the British occupation of Boston and the Siege of Boston. Garrett, could we please start with the British occupation of Boston? What was that occupation about?
Yeah, so the British soldiers first come to Boston in 1768, and they're responding to outbreaks of colonial resistance due to the Townshend duties. They don't end up staying too long that time because after that famous event in 1770, the Boston Massacre, in an attempt to quiet the tensions, the British imperial authorities had pulled the soldiers out of Boston itself, out into the islands in the harbor. But they will come back after the Boston Tea Party and then the rising tensions, this time to an entirely new level from the Coercive Acts in 1774. So there's going to be around 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers, it seems, in Boston at the beginning of 1775. When then tensions are going to reach, an even higher level, and really open war is going to break out with the fighting going out to Lexington and Concord and then back into Boston.
And what about the Siege of Boston? Would you tell us when that started and what the siege entailed?
The siege is going to begin right after, essentially, the famous fighting from April 19th, 1775, out to Lexington and Concord. Very quickly, there's going to be about 15 to 20,000 colonial militia who are going to march from throughout New England and essentially surround Boston on their own with really very little direction. However, the Massachusetts authorities are going to quickly start acting to put some degree of authority over those men. And you'll see Artemas Ward being chosen to command that army that was around Boston at the time. So this is, of course, before Washington even arrives, but there is a very large force of colonial militias, Minutemen, who had surrounded the city.
Do we happen to know what the British thought about the siege? Because there were way more colonists surrounding Boston than there were British soldiers in it. And we have to remember that at this point in time, Boston was situated on this tiny little peninsula, the Shawmut Peninsula, and that just this tiny narrow strip of land, the Boston Neck, connected this peninsula to the mainland. So I have to imagine the British weren't pleased about being surrounded.
I don't think it would have been a surprise by any means. Going back at least into the fall of 1774, the true extent of their authority was limited to Boston, where the army was. They had made a few excursions out, including the powder alarm, going out to Lexington and Concord. They'd made a couple of excursions up to Salem, and they keep running into stronger and stronger reactions from the colonists. And then once open fighting breaks out, of course, at Lexington and Concord, they realize they're in a difficult position. One of the things that they will do is apparently try to decide if they want to go to the high ground on the peninsulas, either to the north at Charlestown or to the south at Dorchester. And when Gage makes the decision to go north, we end up with the Battle of Bunker Hill, which is going to reinforce the fact that they are in a siege and they are surrounded by a lot of people who are very unhappy with their presence.
It doesn't really seem like these siege lines were really all that effective. I mean, when I think of a siege, I think of something that's meant to surround an enemy's position and cut off all their supply lines. And yet, the way you describe it, the British really did have access to supplies, from Boston Harbor and the sea, and they were really able to get their soldiers out to Lexington and Concord and north even to Charlestown and Bunker Hill.
I think you could say that for sure. And this points out the key weakness that the colonists and eventually the fledgling American forces face throughout the Revolution. And that is the inability to do anything about the Royal Navy and the supremacy of the British on the sea. So they're able to keep up a steady stream of supplies as well as holding open an escape route. And although conditions certainly do decline in Boston, with the Vassals, for example, they're going to have a young son who will die in November of 1775. And it seems as if they blame that upon the siege, and that stimulates them to then pack up and head to Nova Scotia well before the city is evacuated. So it does seem like conditions declined, but that major weakness of the British always controlling the sea right up until the Battle of the Capes before Yorktown is constantly going to be a thorn in Washington's and the other leaders' sides.
So, speaking of Washington, he enters this scene beginning on June 15, 1775, when the Second Continental Congress appoints him to be its commander-in-chief of the new Continental Army. And from that appointment, he makes his way up to Boston so that he's here on the ground to take command by July 2nd, 1775. So, Garrett, would you tell us about Washington's arrival in Boston and how he reacted to the force in the siege that he was now expected to command?
Sure. I think his arrival from the perspective of the men in the army who were here is a little underwhelming compared to what we might think of now, knowing who Washington becomes. One of my favorite responses comes from the diary of a private who simply wrote, "Reigned a new general from Philadelphia." So the excitement in him is palpable, right? One of the great myths, 19th century myths that grows up around the Revolution is this big grand review, essentially, when Washington takes command underneath a large elm tree on Cambridge Common. But there's no evidence of that happening. It seems like Washington shows up and goes right to work. For Washington, he's disappointed by what he sees. He points out that he finds the presence of boys, deserters, and Negroes in the army. And to him, this symbolizes that Massachusetts may not be capable of providing what their delegates in Congress had promised. Washington, I think on a larger scale, suffers what many of us would have arriving in this situation, and that's culture shock. When Washington came from Virginia to Massachusetts, it truly was like he was going to a different country. They were that different culturally, economically, socially. The colonies were all far more connected to London than they had been to each other prior to the Revolution. And Washington writes to friends in Virginia and says that these New Englanders are a nasty and dirty people, and that he's found an unaccountable kind of stupidity in the lower sort of the people making up his army. And he's horrified by the lack of discipline, this democratic spirit, which New Englanders are so proud of, to this much more hierarchical culture from Virginia that Washington's coming from. To him, this is shocking to see men electing officers and paying very little attention to what their superiors are telling them to do. So these are some of the things that he sets right out to try to fix. Really, he's trying to create a mirror image of the soldiers he's facing in Boston with that British army, which he's never quite able to do. Eventually comes to realize that that's not exactly going to happen, but he doesn't seem to ever give up the hope of making it happen.
Do we know why Washington chose to headquarter in Cambridge? I mean, there were other locations he could have chosen, like Roxbury or Dorchester Heights or Charlestown, and yet he chose Cambridge. So when did he choose Cambridge? Why did he choose Cambridge? And why did he choose to headquarter in the Vassal House?
I think the most obvious reason is that Cambridge is kind of in the middle, right? You have, by the time Washington arrives, the British had won the Battle of Bunker Hill with paying a great sacrifice, but they have taken control of the Charlestown Peninsula. So Washington has soldiers extending all the way north to there and then all the way south down to Roxbury. So being in Cambridge allows him to be in the middle of those two major wings of the army. Plus, there are a lot of soldiers encamped in Cambridge itself. So I think as far as Cambridge, it had already sort of started becoming headquarters area. That's where Artemus Ward is when Washington shows up to take command from him. So it seems like it just was a natural location. Why he makes the Vassal House his headquarters is an excellent question. We don't know for sure. It is not where he goes first. He starts out for a little bit less than 2 weeks in the Wadsworth House, which was the president of Harvard's house, and he's sharing that with General Charles Lee. But that wasn't a workable situation. So he seems to have worked with the civil authorities in Massachusetts to move out to the Vassal House. I think the major reasons probably were its size. It's larger, and so there's an important social element to being an 18th century military leader. Its location, he's close enough to keep an eye on those other soldiers that are over towards the campus in the common more, but he's also trying to build distance between them. In his mind, the officers, the leaders of the army, are supposed to be the social superiors of the men who are in the army. And so building physical distance helps with that. And I think the other thing is that if you've been to Mount Vernon, it's a large mansion sitting on a hill overlooking the river. And at the Vassal House, it is a large mansion sitting on a hill overlooking the Charles River at the time. So it could have just very likely felt like home to him.
Earlier, you mentioned that Washington would stay in the Vassal House for about 9 months, which was the second longest period he'd live anywhere during the Revolutionary War. So what was his life like in the Vassal House? Specifically, Pamela is really curious about whether anyone else stayed in the house with Washington.
Yes, the house would have been filled with people coming and going at all times. There were staff officers sleeping there. General Horatio Gates and his wife stayed in the house before he was sent off on other duties. So it was a home as well as a headquarters, but not just for Washington. And then about halfway through the siege, Martha Washington is going to show up and be there for a little bit over half of the time. So that's another precedent that's going to be set that they'll follow throughout the rest of the war. I think most of the time, Washington was very busy working with his staff officers. There was no real administrative support. So in the headquarters of the Army is carrying out the functions like we would think of today as a Defense Department, the Pentagon. Those things are happening in headquarters. So it was a very busy place. And I think Washington, nonetheless, it probably felt similar to living at Mount Vernon. He has a household staff, including at least 2 people that we would believe were enslaved and hired out from a local owner. And he also has William Lee, his enslaved manservant, with him. And Martha Washington, it's reported that she brought servants from Mount Vernon who would have been enslaved as well. So in that regard, it probably felt very much like home. Also, we know that Washington's life in Mount Vernon was very busy with guests coming and going all the time.
So the Longfellow House Washington headquarters is really a house that can claim that not only did George Washington sleep there, but Martha Washington slept there as well.
Yes, for sure.
I wonder whether Washington hosted any parties at the Vassal House. Because during the Revolutionary War, many British generals did throw parties in the places where they headquartered, especially during the winter. In fact, there was this really big party for General Sir William Howe in Philadelphia in May 1778 called the Meschianza. So I wonder, since you mentioned that there's this social aspect to being a military leader in the 18th century, whether this social aspect extended to hosting parties.
We don't believe so. There was, again, another 19th century myth that said the Washingtons had a celebration of their anniversary in January of 76. But there's no evidence of that. And it seems like the entertainments they did would have been a few people coming over for dinner. The Washingtons seem to have been very careful to draw distinctions between themselves as leaders of a Republican army, small r, in those demands of classical republicanism that they believed in so much that it would have been improper for them to host parties like the British were. In fact, there's a very interesting event with Martha Washington as she's making her way from Virginia to Massachusetts, stopping in Philadelphia and living through a minor, could have been a very major diplomatic issue between the delegates from different colonies. And the New Englanders had a stricter view of what was proper during wartime than some of the delegates from the middle and southern colonies, and they wished to have a party for Martha, and she kind of got in the middle between those two factions, but she very adeptly diffused it, showing, I think, some of her natural qualities as a politician that helps her and George later on.
Speaking of regional distinctions, We know from our earlier conversation with Erica Dunbar in episode 136 that when Washington served as president, he and Martha traveled with some of their enslaved people. Did the Washingtons travel with some of their enslaved people during the war? And if they did the Vassal House have slave quarters like the Washingtons would have had at Mount Vernon? Or did their enslaved people stay in the house with them?
So we believe they stayed in the house, probably either up on the third floor or where they worked, less desirable areas like the kitchen or something like that. The slavery was not new in the Vassal House. Its builders, John Vassal, had enslaved people working inside and outside, some of which seem to have been around the property during the war as well, and one of which will later on petition the state of Massachusetts as they're selling off the estate for some type of compensation for work that he claimed to have done during the war. Washington always had his enslaved manservant, William Lee, with him. And we don't know who Martha brought with her, but there is, like I said, a mention of servants coming from Mount Vernon. And if she brings servants from Mount Vernon, they are going to be enslaved almost certainly. Washington, I think this is a little bit off topic, but one of the things I think that Washington would have been most surprised by was finding black men carrying guns in the Continental Army and how to react to that. At first, they hold meetings and decide to kick them all out of the army, but he's not going to do that. He'll end up changing his mind. And I think most Americans don't realize that the Continental Army of the American Revolution is the most integrated American fighting force well into the 20th century. Washington is also going to have an interaction with Phyllis Wheatley, the famous poet of African descent, who writes him a poem, and they have a correspondence with each other, ending with him inviting her to visit the headquarters. So I think all of those experiences he has in the house are going to speed up or encourage an evolution in Washington's beliefs about slavery that had already begun during the war, but is only going to accelerate after the war.
Now, the siege of Boston ended on March 17, 1776, when the British fleet and its soldiers moved into Boston Harbor and then out of it. Garrett, when exactly did Washington move out of the Vassal House, and what happened to the house after Washington and his army moved out of the Boston area?
Washington does not leave immediately on March 17th because the British don't exactly leave either. They all get on ships, they sail out into the harbor, and they hang out for a little while. Washington is finally going to depart on April 4th of 1776. Now, he had started sending some elements of the army south to New York before that, but he had kept some behind as well, just in case the British had decided to come back. But finally, on April 4th, he will head down to New York as well to start preparing the defenses down there. The house itself remains empty for a few years. Eventually, it is seized by the state of Massachusetts, and it gets sold off as abandoned property.
When it was sold off as abandoned property, did the state follow the same procedures as it would have when it sold off other Loyalist property, or was the Vassal House not considered to be Loyalist property because it was abandoned so early? And, it had served as Washington's headquarters.
The state of Massachusetts actually passes a law that allows them to seize these abandoned houses, including the Vassal House and some of the other houses in the area as well. After that, they're allowed to go ahead and then sell them off.
So by April of 1776, Washington has moved out of the Vassal House. And after we take a moment to talk about our sponsor, I'd like for us to explore how and when the Vassal House became the Henry Wadsworth Longfellow House. The Omohundro Institute has been the proud publisher of award-winning books since 1943. Can you believe it's already July? I don't know about you, but I'm taking my vacation next month. And when I go on vacation, I like good books to read. Now, one book I'm considering for my vacation read also happens to be one of the Omohundro Institute's most recent publications. Daniel Livesay's Children of Uncertain Fortune, Mixed-Race Jamaicans in Britain and the Atlantic Family, 1733 to 1833. Produced in partnership with the University of North Carolina Press, this book traces the largely forgotten 18th century migration of elite mixed-race individuals from Jamaica to Great Britain. Now, one reason I'm interested in this book is it involves Atlantic travel. Livesay used wills, legal petitions, family correspondences, and inheritance lawsuits to follow hundreds of children born to white planters and Caribbean women of color who crossed the Atlantic for educational opportunities, professional apprenticeships, marriage prospects, or even refuge from colonial prejudices. I'm also interested in this book because Children of Uncertain Fortune explores connections, cultures, and ideas that circulated around the broader British Atlantic world. Livesay investigates how the presence of these elite mixed-race Britons pushed popular opinion in the Atlantic world toward narrower conceptions of race and kinship. In fact, Livesay found that upper-class Britons came to resent these colonial transplants and covet their inheritances, which means that, according to Livesay's research, these ideas and jealousies can demonstrate just how family intimacy can also give way to racial inclusion. Now, I'm interested in these topics because Tim and I will be making our own transatlantic crossing next month when we travel to Gibraltar, a British overseas territory since 1713. Now, Gibraltar is a place with a lot of history, and a place that has a very different culture than the one I'm used to. From what I've read, I will get to experience a mix of British, Spanish, and North African cultures while I'm there. So I'm curious about how Britons today look upon this mix of cultures and race, and whether it bears any similarity to how they viewed it back in the 18th century. So yes, different places and different contexts, but I will be thinking about all these issues anyway, so why not consider Daniel Livesay's Children of Uncertain Fortune as the book I'll read on my vacation? But what about you? What are you reading this summer? Let me know by leaving a comment in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. If you aren't already a member, it's free to join. Just text BF World to 33444 and click the link that I'll send you. Garrett, when exactly did Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, that famous 19th century poet, acquire the Vassal House and turn it into the Longfellow House?
In 1791, the house was purchased by a guy named Andrew Craigie. And Craigie had been the apothecary general of the Continental Army during the war and knew of the house. And so he kind of bought it because of those historic connections and then spent a lot of money expanding it. He lived very lavishly. He had some land deals go poorly for him. So he ends up actually dying bankrupt in 1819. And that leaves the house to his much younger widow, Elizabeth. And she is living in this very large house. And to help pay some of the bills, she starts renting out one or two of the extra rooms in the house. And being right down the street from Harvard, she has a really good location. Most of her renters are either going to be professors or students. There's many other famous boarders, such as the senator and famous orator Edward Everett. Jared Sparks is going to be in the house when he's working on his first sort of professional edition of Washington's Letters. But in 1837, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is going to come on down Brattle Street about a year after he had started working at Harvard and talks to Mrs. Craigie and starts renting 2 rooms up on the second floor. 6 years later, he is going to marry Frances Appleton from Boston. And Frances, or Fanny as she was known to her family and friends, her father happens to be one of the richest men in the country due to investments in textile mills out in what becomes Lowell, Massachusetts. And so he's actually going to buy the house for the Longfellows and give it to them essentially as a wedding present / dowry.
Wow, this house really does have a lot of connections with different people throughout history.
It does.
Abraham Lincoln. Does Lincoln have a connection to the Longfellow House?
Abraham Lincoln. Well, we have a picture of him. As far as direct connections, I would say they're a little more tenuous, but Lincoln was a fan of Longfellow's works, especially one called The Building of the Ship, which was a very powerful allegory about union. And Longfellow does write about Lincoln's election and was a big supporter. Longfellow is an abolitionist. He doesn't seem to share a lot of his fellow abolitionists' doubts about Lincoln. So they're a little bit indirect, but they are there.
So speaking of Longfellow, what was his life like in this new house that had once served as Washington's headquarters?
Longfellow has a great line where he says, "He undertakes a great house, undertakes a great care." And so I think he very quickly realized he had a lot of investment to do to take care of his house, but he certainly loved the house. When the Longfellows take over the house in 1843, Henry is only just becoming well known as a poet, but he very quickly is going to become far and away the most famous writer in the United States. And then I would say by the middle of the 1850s, he is a celebrity in the modern sense of the word. And the Longfellows are living a very comfortable lifestyle. They're hiring servants to work in the house. They're traveling extensively throughout Europe. He is having visitors come from all over the world, like Charles Dickens. Oscar Wilde comes later. The Emperor of Brazil stops by for a visit. So it's a pretty nice life. And it actually takes 7 years for Frances Appleton to agree to marry Henry after their first meeting. But they end up having an amazing relationship. He called her a woman of genius. He views her as an intellectual equal, and their interests just merged perfectly. And they end up having 6 children, one who dies as an infant, but 5 of the 6 make it to adulthood. And it's a good life they have. They host almost what we would think of as a intellectual salon in the European sense of the New England writers who are participating in this sort of very rapid growth of American literature, and other type of intellectual figures, both in the United States and abroad, are coming and visiting. And Longfellow's best friend in the entire world is Charles Sumner, who becomes the senator from Massachusetts. So it's a very well-connected, comfortable life.
Were Longfellow and his wife Fanny also connected to people like Lucy Stone and Sarah Josepha Hale, who were both advocates for women's rights during this period? You talked about how they had open views about abolitionism and were hosting salons, and Fanny was Longfellow's intellectual equal. And I wonder if their open views about all these issues extended to women's rights.
It seems to have not. He was very interested in education for women, including his daughter Alice, who attends and goes on to be one of the founders at what becomes Radcliffe College. Henry's brother was a little more involved in suffrage movements. Fanny Longfellow tragically dies in 1861. And so she doesn't seem to have either had the opportunity, or I think also she came from a very privileged, wealthy background, and I don't think she quite understood what most women faced in the United States. And so I think her economic background somewhat detached her from the suffrage cause and women's causes. So they seem to have not been as connected to those as they were other social issues like abolitionism, pacifism.
You mentioned earlier that Longfellow became one of the most famous Americans in terms of his poetry and literature. In fact, he was really kind of like the United States' second rock star of the 19th century behind Washington Irving. And I wonder, do we know if Longfellow wrote any of his iconic poems that made him so famous at home in the Longfellow House?
We think just about everything after 1845 would have been worked on in the study. Now, it's a little bit difficult to say because they do summer in places like Newport or Nahant. So he's going to be writing in places like that as well. But I think you can directly tie a lot of his work to the house. Some poems do mention parts of the house or experiences in the house, as well as the areas directly surrounding the home. He certainly seems to have been very inspired by both the house and its surroundings.
What about Paul Revere's Ride? Did he happen to work on this poem in his house?
Yes, that certainly is one he would have worked on. Longfellow's connection to Paul Revere through the poem is an interesting one that has brought him a fair amount of criticism, I would say, over especially the 20th century, as its historical inaccuracies have been pointed out. But I think the interesting thing about that poem is that Longfellow was not writing a poem about the American Revolution. He was writing a Civil War poem in 1860 as the secession of southern states is beginning. He's using the American Revolution as sort of a rallying cry for union, much like Abraham Lincoln does in his first inaugural. So I feel like I have to defend Longfellow a little bit because he knew that historically he was not painting an accurate portrait of Paul Revere, but it wasn't his intention.
Now, Longfellow died in 1882. So what happened to the house after his death, and how did his house become a National Historic Site?
So his family was very interested in both preserving the legacy of their father and of the house. After Henry's death in 1882, his oldest daughter, Alice, essentially takes over the home. She never marries, never moves out, and lives there until her death in 1928. In 1913, there were 4 surviving children of Henry and Fanny Longfellow, and they formed a trust to preserve the house. And that trust then is actually the body that will convey the house to the National Park Service in 1972. The last Longfellow family member, a guy named Harry Dana, lived in the house up until 1950. And it was only after his death that the trust started looking for an agency to permanently take care of the house. So it takes about 20 some years after that before it finally ends up with the Park Service. But that's a very interesting period as well, because that not only is some of the earliest examples of planned historic preservation in the United States, but Harry and his aunt Alice extend the history of the house into the 20th century through Alice's connections to Radcliffe College. She's sort of a typical progressive era upper middle class woman involved in things like education and relief of the poor. And then Harry Dana, he is a socialist for sure, and also faces some degree of persecution for his sexual orientation, allowing us to bring topics of the social issues of the 20th century into the story.
There are a lot of different stories in this house. So if we come to Cambridge for a visit to the Longfellow House, Washington Headquarters National Historic Site, what can we see and tour on our visit?
The main highlight of a visit to the house is the house tour, in my opinion. Our whole season, which typically runs every year from about the middle of May through the end of October, we offer full tours of the house that are about 55 minutes long and go to the first and second floor. During the summer, we add in shorter versions of the tour if you don't have as much time, that are only about 20 minutes of the first floor only. We also do tours that get out into the historic neighborhoods surrounding the house, and we do tours of the landscape. And there's also a lot of special events, both during the summer, we offer concerts, poetry readings, and even during the winter when we're closed, we offer lectures and so forth in our carriage house. So there's always something going on here at the site.
Yeah, speaking of the landscape, Leslie wonders about the Longfellow Garden and whether we can tour that during our visit. She also wonders whether there are any plants in the garden that date back to Longfellow's time or perhaps even to George Washington's time in the house.
So the garden is open along with the rest of the grounds from dawn to dusk every day of the year. So it doesn't matter if the house is open or not. I definitely would encourage people to come and sit in the garden. It's a lovely little escape from the city around us. We do offer tours of the garden on a daily basis, so you can get more information about it that way. We also have brochures that we have made specifically about the garden. We have a few plants on the site as a whole from Longfellow's time. Probably the most impressive as you come up is the massive linden tree that is to the east of the house. You can't miss it. We know that that was there because Longfellow talked about it. And we also have a lot of lilac bushes that are from Longfellow's time. So if you're in the area during the late spring, it's definitely a wonderful time to stop by to smell the lilacs and see the waves of purple around the house. As far as the garden, there are not original plants. However, the garden as you see it today has been restored using 1925 blueprints. Alice Longfellow hired a lady named Ellen Biddle Shipman from Philadelphia to come up and redesign her garden. And we have the blueprints in our archives as well as the planting lists from that time. So it is very loyal to that 1925 design. But that's Alice Longfellow, not Henry. And as far as George Washington, it seems very likely that hardly any trees would have escaped the grasp of the Continental Army for firewood to keep warm during that winter of 1775.
Now, Garrett, before we move into the time warp, we really need to get your professional advice on this. You've worked at Minuteman National Historical Park out in Concord, Massachusetts. You now work at the Longfellow House, Washington Headquarters National Historic Site in Cambridge. And you're undoubtedly familiar with the Boston National Historical Park and with all the sites on the Freedom Trail. So when we plan our visit to Boston, to get our American Revolution fix, what order should we plan to visit all these parks and sites in?
Ooh, that's a tough one. The nice thing about visiting our house, the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters, is if you're staying in Boston, you can just hop on the Red Line to Harvard Square Station, and probably your entire visit can take about 2 hours, and you can get right back into town for the rest of the Freedom Trail. The biggest thing, I think, for people to do when you're planning a visit to any of the national parks in the area is to go to our websites. They can all be reached through nps.gov, and then you can find out exactly what programs and things we're offering. For example, if you're in the area on a Sunday, if you come on out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we're more than likely going to be having a concert or a poetry reading of some type. So it's always good to know what the sites are offering so that you can plan on what you don't want to miss.
Right. So rather than trying to cover all these sites chronologically, your advice would be that we should plan our visit around all the different special events these parks have to offer us.
I think so, although it would be fun, I suppose, to do a visit to the sites related to the Imperial Crisis in Boston and then hop out and go to Lexington and Concord as well, and then come back in to Cambridge. So I can definitely see the appeal there, too.
Well, thank you for those tips and tricks, Garrett. And now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The time warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
In your opinion, what might have happened if George Washington had chosen to make his headquarters in another house? What would have happened to the Vassal House if George Washington hadn't made it his temporary residence?
In the grand scheme of things, as far as Washington's concerned, I don't know if it makes any difference which house along Brattle Street he would have moved into, but I think it certainly would have made a very big difference in the future of the Vassal House. Most of the other homes end up being private homes still today. So I think the Vassal House very likely could have gone down that road. There's certainly no lack of demand for housing in the Boston area. And so it very likely could have been just another private mansion along Brattle Street. I think it's kind of unlikely that it would have become the home of Henry Longfellow, for example, because the Longfellows wanted the house because of its connections to George Washington. Fanny Longfellow writes her brother and says that they wanted the house that Washington had made every room sacred. When the Longfellow descendants created their trust to preserve the house, they cited 3 reasons: its architecture, a memorial to their father, and a monument to the time George Washington was there. So I certainly don't think we would be talking about the house as part of the National Park Service today without that element of the story.
Now, Garrett, you've given us a preview of a lot of different events that the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site offers. Are there any really special events, programs, or tours coming up that we should be aware of?
There's a lot of things that we do, as I mentioned earlier. Thinking of one specific event coming up in just a couple of weeks on August 25th, we're going to have a full day of events. We will have a band performing, which contains a great grandson of Henry Longfellow. And we will be showing the Disney classic about the American Revolution, Johnny Tremaine, on a large screen out on our lawn to the east of the house. So that should be a big day that will appeal to all of the Revolutionary War buffs in the audience, but also the music fans that might be listening.
Will there also be a reading of Paul Revere's Ride? I mean, it seems like it would fit right in with a viewing of Johnny Tremaine.
I hadn't thought about that, but we may have to add one now.
And you mentioned nps.gov, but is there another place we can look for more information about your historic site and how we can get in contact with you if we have questions?
Sure. I would say there's a couple of things. If you want to go directly to our webpage, you can go to nps.gov/LONG, and that'll take you directly to our webpage. We also have a Facebook page and an Instagram account that you can look us up very easily. The Facebook page has all of our upcoming events, as well as we like to share stories periodically about the house, some of which you're not normally going to hear if you come to a house tour just because of time. And you can also, if anybody would like to directly reach out to me, I can be reached at my government email address, which is Garrett, GARRETT _Cloer, CLOER @nps.gov.
Garrett Cloer, thank you so much for taking us through the history of the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, and for giving us such great tips and tricks about how we can make the most out of our next visit.
My pleasure, Liz. Thank you for having me on.
George Washington arrived in Boston to take command of the newly formed Continental Army and of the Boston siege lines on July 2nd, 1775. Now, although we might think of this as a really important event in the history of the Revolutionary War, as Garrett revealed, the soldiers around Boston weren't necessarily that impressed. Of course, the feeling was entirely mutual. Washington wasn't at all impressed with the soldiers under his new command, nor was he impressed with New England. In fact, Washington suffered from a bit of culture shock when he came to New England. For example, Washington found it difficult to understand a society that exercised more democratic and leveling ideas than he and his fellow Virginians did. Like, it didn't ever make sense to Washington why soldiers would elect their officers. In his view, the Army really should be a place where social betters commanded a well-regulated and well-disciplined fighting force. Of course, Washington found neither when he arrived in Boston. Frustration with his command and with the culture shock he experienced must have made the Vassal House seem like a welcome respite for Washington. Just like Mount Vernon, the Vassal House was large and spacious, with a commanding view of the river. Of course, in Boston, the view was of the Charles River, not of the Potomac River Washington was accustomed to. It seems like life in the Vassal House for Washington was a good, if full one. Staff officers and the business of command took place in the house during Washington's residence. And while George and Martha Washington may not have thrown large parties, just getting dinner on the table every night for Washington and his officers would have commanded the attention of Martha Washington and the enslaved people she and George brought with them. Now, Washington resided in the Vassal House for the second longest period he would reside anywhere during the war, just about 9 months. And after he vacated so that he and his army could move south to New York City, it seems like the house stood vacant until auctioned off by the state of Massachusetts as abandoned property in 1791. That's when Andrew Craigie purchased the house, which in turn would fall into the care of his widow in 1819. Now, in 1837, a young Harvard professor named Henry Wadsworth Longfellow rented 2 rooms in the house on the second floor. And Longfellow quickly fell in love with both the house and its history as Washington's headquarters. Longfellow eventually came to own the house. It was a wedding gift. And from there on out, he worked in the house, raised his family in the house, and hosted the many dignitaries of his day who all came to pay their respects to this literary star. So, the house that John Vassal built in 1759 has a long and rich history. A history that's so rich, park rangers like Garrett Cloer can connect the house to just about any historically significant person or event who lived and took place between the 1760s and the 1970s. You will find more information about the Longfellow House, Washington's headquarters National Historic Site, its website, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/194. I'm really excited because our Cleveland meetup is just around the corner. I hope I'll see you at Shooter's Waterfront Cafe at 4 p.m. on July 21. You'll find a link to the restaurant and the date and time of our meetup listed on the show notes page and in your Ben Franklin's World app. And if you do plan to attend, please just send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. What are you reading this summer? I hope you'll share all your history and non-history related reads with me in the Ben Franklin's World listener community on Facebook. Because personally, I always love a lot of books on my reading list. I mean, books keep life interesting. To join the community, just text BF World to 33444 and click the link that I'll send you. Finally, what other historic sites would you like to learn more about? Assistant producer Holly White and I are always on the lookout for sites with interesting stories to tell. So tell us about the interesting historic sites that you visited or the sites that you'd like to discover more about. Send me an email, liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.